My name is Robert Bluestein. I am, among other things, a painter, a photographer, an artist, a general artist, an adventure seeker, a world traveler. I love baseball and have a dry sense of humor and enjoy a finely prepared meal. I love a good conversation and intellectual stimulation as much as anyone you could possibly meet, I suppose. But for the past 23 years or 24 years, I've been on a quest. And it's a quest to write a book on what I studied in school. And that is a book on medieval history. And in particular on the momentous event of 1066. So I started with this idea in mind and to write it in the first-hand account as much as I could, getting primary sources and church documents and marriage certificates and funeral services and land charters, and letting the people of 1066 tell the story to you as directly as they can. It's not always possible. There's huge gaps in our knowledge, after all, and we have to allow ourselves to take some license wherever there is such gaps. And we also take into account that the people telling the story are telling them for an audience. And we weigh them against one another. And the more research I did on this, the more it became a part of who I was. And, anyone that knew me knew that this conversation was going to come up. Less for them than it was for me. 1066, my story of the Three Kings, is a vivid and surprising portrait of England over 1,000 years ago. It's a world of Gothic gore, vigilance, and virtuality and violence. It's of spiritualism and savagery. But it's also a romantic world of cathedrals and chivalry and temples and knights and the things we think of. It's where even the most serious things are done with a sense of play. So I've tried to tell this story through the lens of a medieval mind and in a way that we could relate to it today. And using language that conveys the idea without losing the listener or the reader in this sense with words that either are misplaced or no longer in use. We come back and we look at these humans just like us coming up on 1000 AD. For them it was a millennium of calamity, and they hadn't even gotten into 1066 yet. For in just 19 days, 40,000 of their own men would die. In a shocking economic, upside-down, turmoil, tumultuous series of events that destroyed the English culture and society as they knew it at the time. Their world would come crashing to an end in one sense and start a new beginning on another. So join me on this journey, an unexpected surprise for you as it was for me, of nuances and of new discoveries and new evidence that tells a different story and demands a different verdict than perhaps what we've given them in the past. History is one of these things that is the lifeblood of who we are and how we decide we're going to tell our story for our past. There is something that drives us so deeply into wanting to leave for tomorrow what we were unable to do today, that these stories are invaluable. And as you write this, as I write this and as you read this, perhaps you'll come up with more questions. I certainly hope so, because a good history book has more questions afterward than answers within. October 15th, 1066, on a battlefield in the south of England. I wanted to tell this story in its fullest, most complete way, right where it ends. I wanted to begin at the outcome. So I'm taking you to this battlefield in Hastings in 1066 with tens of thousands sprawled on the ground on Senlac Hill, overlooking this miscellaneous loss of life and trying to, determine its meaning and its outcome. The subtle light of the new morning began to slip through the fog and a mist of a cool and silent battlefield. It hardly seemed a place where 10,000 lay dead, but there they were, silhouetted on the earthen red carpet of blood, men and horse alike. The eye almost has to be persuaded to take in the carnage among the surrounding trees that rose straight and tall, their peaceful limbs never revealing the terror that occurred beneath their high branches and the arching clouds. The silence would give no clue as to the slashing of swords and the aerial assault of arrows that rained down terror from the skies. The wind bristled through the trees as an eerily quiet group of people began to meander through the dead. Almost all had been stripped of their last possessions, said Williams of Malmesbury. The ground was littered with their legs and arms and pieces of flesh and coagulating pools of blood. He would end by saying that weaving in and out of the dead were dogs, barking, and a cacophone of falcons, hawks, crows overhead. The Bayeux Tapestry shows some of the carnage that took place that day. Adding to the aura of this conflict was the length of this battle. In an era when most battles were completed within a half hour, few could have imagined a clash that lasted 9 hours, maybe 10. There weren't many possible outcomes this battle was going to have, but victory or death. And neither side, to be fair, expected anything less. Harold could have ran and extended the war, might have been wise to do so, but that wasn't what he did that day. And William needed Harold to fight him decisively, for he could not extend the war over hillside and English rolling mountains, streams, and rivers. Beseeching God for mercy, the 7th Duke of Normandy was now on English soil, riding high. From his position in the saddle, William sat in silence, surveying the scene. He had not allowed the onlookers to search for the dead until he could be sure there was no valuable instrument of war, of coinage, of metal, of any kind. But he had made a promise to show penance in the impending bloodbath. In order to get the promise of the Pope, the blessings of the banner that he could provide, he agreed to build an abbey where King Harold fell. With wave of his hand and a staff of banners lifted about, William organized his carts, turned his horses, they got loaded, and they watched the women and the clergy clean up the battlefield. As they made their way to the scattered hillside, the scene must have been shocking. Can you imagine? For those who bore witness to the scene, words simply had no form. Like many medieval battles, the sight was sickening. William had certainly seen his share of dead fighters, but rarely on a scale such as this. Aside from the occasional barking of dogs, the field lay rash, ankle deep in the blood of those lucky enough to stand. It was now, quote, 4 hours after the rise of the sun, said Bishop Odo, And the sun began to break through. The lines began to clear. The air hung heavy with uncertainty over England's future, as a new feudal world of Normans and a new way of life would be an almost friendly adjustment. The frozen fields were a twisted mass of lifeless bones and puddles of entrails and bowels, as it was also written. They lie where they fell, said one chronicler, with dull pale mouths still fierce and determined, lay with their jaws still clenched, with the foul charred glass and the smell of dead grass in the air. Gone were the Anglo-Saxon days of past, and within 2 generations, all of England would not only be consumed, but would be consuming all. A search party that day of clergy and women set about the task for looking for Harold. Anglo-Saxon tradition, after all, had told them the legendary King Arthur. And one couldn't help but to hope, what if Harold wasn't here? Perhaps they wondered if Harold had survived to fight another day, to be a hero for the English once again. Who would arise, thought those scanning the battlefield, to fight the devils that King Edward the Confessor was said to have foretold in a dream the night before the battle would take place. Given the hacked-up conditions of the corpses, how could anyone be sure of a positive identification for Harold Godwinson? The Normans convinced themselves that the fight was against scarcely civilized Angles, Saxons, Welsh. Unlike the distinctive Norman style of shaving their heads high enough to wear a helmet, most of the Anglo-Saxons wore their hair long and came to the fight with mustaches and beards. It was easy to pick them out on the battlefield. These Normans, after all, were meant to live in subjugation. Finding Harold's body among the dead, people continued to scan and to look. At one point, Elizabeth Swanneck, the beautiful lover of Harold, looks frantically for her suitor, followed by an entourage and a retinue of people to help her. Suddenly she is beckoned to inspect what one believes is the fallen king. You know, at this point, we, just as humans that we are, endeavor to imagine this woman, not a legal wife of Harold. It wasn't that uncommon in the day. But she's beckoned, and she strikes one of the soul of a maiden awaiting her lover's return. Her loud wails brought an official end to the idea, however, that somehow Harold might have escaped rebellion. To the Normans, the fading cries of Edith Swanneck ended all murmurings of a King Harold return. William turned to lead his men away from the scene upon locating the place where the English king had fallen. Despite his victory, William knew his work was not complete. He wasn't sure what to expect after all. Perhaps indecisive, he took his time marching on London. He was unsure if he would encounter bands of rebellious Englishmen along the way, and there was no way to measure the mood. Under Harold, the country was prospering and growing faster than it had ever had before. He was ruling in a very Anglo-Saxon manner, uniting with his earls, granting land where he felt fit, and meeting with his witan, the legal advisors that made up of both earls and clergy together. William had won them over. He had effectively been a co-king for 8 months with Edward the Confessor.